Hi everyone, welcome to your first video lecture in biology. So this semester and over the year, we're going to be thinking about ideas and concepts that can help us to make sense of the diversity of life that we see around us. And this could be as something as small as a single bacterium that's living in the soil, all the way to humans like us, or your pet dog or cat, or to creepy spiders. And it's going to encompass things like how all of these different organisms work or how they function on a cellular and a molecular level, all the way to how they've evolved over millions and millions of years. And all of these ideas fall under the category of biology, which is the study of life or living things. So, because of that, the most fundamental question that we can ask as biologists is, what does it mean to say something is alive? What does it mean to say something is living? So I'd like you to take a minute right now and look around you, and see if you can see something or think of something that you would say is for sure alive, and also something that you would say is for sure not alive. So pause this video here if you need to give yourself a minute to do that. Okay. So maybe depending on where and when you're watching this, you might have had family members or pets or house plants that you saw. And I think most of us would feel pretty confident saying that all of those things are alive. It was probably really easy to find something that's not alive if you have pens or pencils or a notebook or your laptop or your computer sitting in front of you. And these are things that I think, again, most of us would feel pretty confident saying are not alive. So in this video, we're going to be talking about what allows us to say that a dog is alive, but a laptop is not. And before we start getting into the main part of this video where we do that, I want to make a couple quick points. So to say something is alive versus not alive, it's not a simple one sentence definition. So we tend to think about it more in the sense of characteristics or properties that living things have and non-living things don't have. And one caveat is that depending on where you look, these characteristics can be listed a little differently in different places. So there's a video that I made last year where I only listed 6 characteristics, whereas we're going to be talking about 7. Sometimes the properties in the list will slightly vary or be worded a little bit differently, but in general, when you look at the different videos and articles and textbook pages, the gist is the same. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the same properties that are listed in your textbook so that we have a sort of common language to talk about what makes something alive and the characteristics that these living things share. Okay, so without further ado, let's get on to our properties. So they're all listed here on this page, and then I'll go into each one in further detail on the subsequent slides. So our characteristics are growth and development, reproduction, energy processing, evolution, order, and response to environment. So, oh, and regulation. So let's start talking about growth and development as well as reproduction. Growth and development is our first characteristic, and this is the idea that living things tend to grow over time and also change form or develop. And 2 really obvious examples of this would be thinking about how a tadpole changes its body plan to turn into a frog later in its life, or in this picture, we have the growth and development of a caterpillar into a butterfly, which is emerging from its chrysalis. So it goes from sort of a wormy looking thing to something with wings, and it's probably colored very differently to compared to when it was a caterpillar. So those are 2 really dramatic examples, but you can think even human development, the way a person looks as a baby versus a toddler versus a young child, those are very different. And the way you look now is probably different than how you looked a year or 2 ago, and you'll continue to change in form as you get older. So that's this idea of development, that organisms change their body plans as they get older. And it goes along with this idea of growth. You could think of a tree that is going to get bigger and bigger as it gets older. And people get bigger and bigger too, up to a certain point, right? Once you're fully grown and you've reached a certain height, then you stop. But there's been some growth that has occurred. And even on a smaller scale for single celled organisms, they tend to get just a tiny bit bigger and then they'll divide. And then the two resulting cells will also just get a little bit bigger and then they'll divide again. So it doesn't have to be a dramatic amount of growth, but some amount of growth and development is a characteristic of life. And that brings us to our second property, which is reproduction. So living things can create offspring. And it doesn't mean that they will or that they do, but the potential is there for the species in question. So this can be as simple as a single bacterium splitting in half and becoming two bacteria. And it can also be two organisms that sexually reproduce, creating a new offspring. So reproduction or cell division, depending on whether the species in question is multicellular or just one cell. Okay. So our next two properties are energy processing and evolution. So let's look at energy processing first. And this has to do with the chemical reactions that have to take place in order for us to stay alive, which really boils down to the energy that it takes to do all of the work of being alive. So, when I was talking about the characteristic on the previous slide of growth and development, that takes energy in order to happen. In order to grow, we need food and we need energy. And the same goes in order to develop. So living things get energy from food, or if it's a plant and it's photosynthetic, that energy can come from the sun. And the process of getting this energy and harnessing it to do work requires a lot of chemistry that we refer to collectively as metabolism. So, being able to utilize energy in order to stay alive, that's another characteristic. And then we also have evolution. So, this one is the idea that if you look at populations of living things over really long periods of time, there will be genetic changes that happen over that time, over generations. And these changes are programmed into an organism through its DNA. And the changes that happen are often changes that will help the organism survive and reproduce. And these helpful changes are called adaptations. And so we have an example here of a zebra, and the stripes on a zebra are an adaptation because the stripes actually help the zebra to ward off flies, which can carry diseases that will be passed on to the zebra if they're bitten by these flies. So, energy processing and evolution. Our next two are order and response to the environment. So, let's start with this one, order. So, what this means is that living things aren't arranged randomly into blobs or anything like that. They are often complex, but underlying that complexity is a certain regularity and organization. And one major way to think about this is the idea that um, living things are often organized around cells. So, having cellular structure is a common feature of living things. And we can think of cells as being sort of the basic unit of life. And it can be just one cell if you're single celled. Or for us humans, we've got millions of cells that are arranged into even more levels of organization. So, we have different cells that make up specific tissues, and then those tissues make up organs, et cetera, et cetera. And then over here, we have response to the environment. So this one is the idea that living things are going to be able to sense and respond to changes or stimuli in their environment. And this picture shows a sunflower. Maybe you've seen this, but sunflowers are able to sort of track the sun as it moves across the sky. And so they'll face the sun as it's coming up in the morning, and then as it moves, the sunflower will change the way it's facing. Another example could be a Venus flytrap, which has tiny little, or depending on the size of the Venus flytrap, maybe they're not tiny, but it has mouths that will close up if bugs land inside of them. So the traps can sense the bug's movement, and this causes the mouth of the trap to close up on the bug. Okay. Finally, our last property is regulation. So this is about keeping our internal environments as consistent or as constant as possible. And the process of doing this is called homeostasis. So, one analogy is how you can use a thermostat to keep the temperature on the inside of your house pretty consistent. And in the same way, living things need to keep their internal environments constant. So, this goes for things like temperature and pH and the amount of water inside of an organism's body. This picture is showing a fish, and if you think of something like a salmon that lives part of its life in freshwater rivers and part of its life in the salty water of an ocean, and when it's making the change between the rivers and the ocean and back, it needs to regulate the amount of salt and water that's in its body, and it's going to do that differently depending on if it's in salty water or freshwater. So while the response to the environment, which was what we were talking about back here, has to do with the outside environment and different stimuli that might be occurring outside of an organism. Regulation has to do with keeping the internal environment of an organism consistent. Okay, so that's it for this video, and I will see you all later.